You've just come back from a European vacation. Maybe you went hiking in the Scottish Highlands, sipped wine in the French countryside, explored ancient Greek history, or took a night train from Helsinki to the Arctic Circle. At some point during the trip, you thought to yourself, wow, life here does not suck. Should I move to Europe? That's kind of what I did 10 years ago. After getting a taste of life on the continent with trips to Ireland, Belgium, Switzerland, and Germany, I decided I had to see if the grass truly was greener on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. Not only did I move to Europe, I became an EU citizen, and Europe has been stuck with my pasty ass ever since. But would I still move to Europe today, in 2026, knowing everything I know about living here that was still an exciting mystery back in August 2016? My name is Joe Bauer, an American immigrant who makes videos comparing life in the US with Europe and beyond. And people sometimes ask me, would I still move to Europe today if I could do it all over again? And in this video, I'm going to tell you why or why not, with some caveats. Let's start by talking about what Europe is, because that very much determines the answer to this question. Now, a favorite red herring of people who spend way too much time online is to pop into someone's mentions to dunk on dumb Americans and remind them that Europe is a continent, not a country. I don't want to get sidetracked too much, but that touches on something that I learned is called the bean soup theory. I made a video about it on Instagram if you want to see that. But suffice it to say, obviously, I know Europe is a continent and not a country. That said, many European countries share similarities with one another that people from outside of Europe, including Americans, envy, like better access to healthcare, more widely available public transportation, stronger social safety nets, access to green spaces, and so on. Nobody actually confuses Germany and Greece with one another. One of those is an objectively beautiful country that feels like a fantasy, and the other, I don't know, has a nice personality? Just kidding, Deutschland. You know ich hab dich lieb. The point is, if you live in Athens or Berlin, you're not going to be looked at as a leper if you don't have a car and rely on public transportation. You also don't have to worry about things like, I don't know, your kids doing shooter drills because of feckless politicians who are too chicken shit to do the obvious solution for an obvious problem. Let's see, how about instead of banning guns, we create a bunch of T-1000 Terminators to protect schools? I mean, look how much they love children! Besides, Greece and Germany, along with 25 other countries, have enough in common with one another that they're members of the European Union. And I would venture that most people who fantasize of one day moving to Europe in broad terms would be game to try out life in any one of those countries. As one Spanish commenter recently put it to me, Europe is a way of life. Now, all that said, I would also venture that the growing number of Americans who fantasize of moving to Europe are actually referring to just a handful of Western and Central European countries. And if I had to guess, I'd say France, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and Germany. Actually, you know what? Scratch that. Not just Germany, Berlin specifically. No offense, but nobody's getting all hot and bothered about living in Bielefeld because it doesn't exist. That one was just for the Germans. Look it up. And there's a pretty obvious reason as to why someone would want to move to Europe in general. I moved to Europe for more walkable cities, better access to public transportation, and to experience different cultures both in my neighborhood and off the back of a train ride. Having access to those things meant, in my mind, a higher quality of life. And that's precisely why Americans want to move to Europe. Forbes reported on a November Gallup poll that revealed 1 in 5 Americans would like to emigrate, specifically 40% of women aged 15 to 44. That's a 400% increase on a similar poll in 2014. And the reason is, they want a better quality of life. Now, how you personally define a better quality of life is going to vary from person to person. I've met Americans who are wildly turned off by the lower salaries as compared to similar jobs in the United States. I've also been met by a series of hanging jaws when I've shared how small our apartment is compared with what most Americans would expect at my age. But I've also met plenty of Americans who, despite the lower salary on paper, feel they have more purchasing power here. In other words, they're not worried about medical catastrophe or having to own and maintain a car, so they're ultimately putting away more money into their bank account. Plus, Europeans, particularly in the North, generally spend less on non-essential consumer goods than Americans and have a stronger culture of frugality, whereas Americans have no problem racking up credit card debt. There are other aspects of living in Europe that likely rank high in someone's factors for having a higher quality of life. Europe, generally speaking, is statistically much safer than the United States. According to a recent study from Matt Ashby, a criminologist at the University College London, the average rate of homicide in 10 European cities is 1.7 per 100,000 people. Chicago is at 22 per 100,000. That's 2.7 times higher than the next worst city, Los Angeles. But as The Economist writes, comparing crime statistics across countries is pretty tricky. Definitions for different crimes differ across different countries, which sounds like a riddle, but you know what I mean. Besides, statistics mean virtually nothing when compared with feelings. Someone might tell you that you are statistically safe, but if you don't feel safe, then all the numbers in the world won't matter. So that's about when I turn to anecdotes. Most people I've spoken with who've lived on both sides of the pond have said they feel safer living in and traveling around Europe than in the United States. I mean, I certainly do. Even though I statistically know that it's highly unlikely I'll be a victim of gun violence in the United States, I'll still feel on edge if I'm alone on a street at night in an American city. Although gun crimes do happen in Europe, it's such a statistical rarity that it truly just does not register in my brain when I'm out late. In the end, I have my reasons for moving to Europe and my reasons for staying. Sometimes those reasons overlap with other people, but sometimes they're reasons I didn't even consider until moving here. The biggest one for me is access to nature. I knew moving here that the public transportation would be better, but what I didn't know is that I could take trains to local and national parks. And having that access unlocked something in me that I didn't know would be so important in my life. And that is having regular and easy access to wild spaces. I mean, we have a forest here in Berlin where I can find trails where I'm all by myself in the middle of a summer afternoon. Because of the car-oriented development of the United States, you generally need a car to access wild spaces. I've talked before about how I grew up in a region surrounded by a national park and some of the country's best metro parks, but they're only accessible with a car. I may do as an adult with long bike rides out of the city that took me through some of these parks, but I miss going on the trails themselves. I used to think that was normal, like, parks are depopulated by design. Of course you need the power of individual transportation to get there. But Europe, and Japan for that matter, showed me that it doesn't need to be that way. And I don't want to ever have to rely on a car to access green spaces, nor do I think anyone else should have to. That wasn't why I moved to Europe in the first place, but it's a pretty damn big reason for why I've stayed. Again, your reasoning might be different, but so long as you're not driven by accumulating significant personal wealth through a large salary with lots of little zeros at the end, I'll always argue that the reasons for moving to Europe far outweigh the reasons for not moving to Europe if you have the means and opportunity to do so. So would I still move to Europe today? As you might have guessed, yeah, pretty much, but with some obvious caveats. If your options for moving to Europe are for some reason exclusively Belarus or Russia, then I'd say maybe write it out where you are now. But honestly, there's not a country I visited in Europe that I couldn't ever imagine myself living in under the right circumstances. And by that, I just mean that I could have the basic security of being able to afford food, shelter, and earn enough, whether locally or remotely, to not constantly worry about my livelihood. Don't get me wrong, I certainly have my preferences on where to live. Places like Trento, Italy, or Girona, Spain would be pretty high on the old wish list. But for better or worse, I'm definitely that cliche traveler who can find someplace in almost any country and think, yeah, I could live here. Whether it's a small Irish city, Helsinki, or a Greek island, I've imagined how life could work there for my family, and it's never scared me or made me feel anxious. And that's because, despite cultural and linguistic differences, my basic needs could be met in any one of those places. All of those places have a town I could live in with a train station, and wild spaces I can reach without a car. I guess the biggest downside about living in Europe for me is that it's pretty much ruined how I see the United States now. That's right, Europe ruined America for me. How's that for some YouTube clickbait nonsense? But to understand what I really mean by that, you can watch this video floating right over my shoulder. Thanks as always for watching, and I'll see you next week to talk about voting in the US and Germany.